I don't even know why I did it. I mean, the only thing I'm supposed to do is yell, "Unclean, unclean," when I'm walking, so that others know to stay far away. I really don't know why I did it, but I do know that my heart was so heavy. Being a leper meant no contact with my family. I missed my wife and my children so much. I couldn't work to support them. I couldn't be with them. I was so alone for so long. And then I saw him, this Jesus. And somehow I knew he was different and armed with the courage you get when you have nothing else to lose. I just went right up to him and I asked him. I asked him to heal me. And then he touched me. He didn't care that he wasn't supposed to touch me. He didn't care about the rules, I guess, because he just reached out and touched me. And I can never explain the magnitude of that touch. I could feel his power surging through me. And in that moment, I was healed. In every way possible.
Wait till I tell you what happened in Capernaum today. Jesus healed the servant of some Roman centurion. Did you hear me? A centurion, a Roman. I mean, they're Gentiles, unbelievers, unclean. They're unwelcome in our country, in our cities, and in our streets. Why would Jesus, a Jew, even look at him, let alone talk to him and listen to him? What was he thinking? But that's not the only thing. Why would a centurion approach Jesus? Now, centurions, well, they think they're better than everybody else. They despise us Jews. They treat their servants like dirt. And they would never, ever ask a Jew for help. So why on earth does this guy go to Jesus, a Jew, to ask for healing for his Jewish servant? Why does he care so much about his servant that he is willing to risk his reputation by approaching Jesus? And then Jesus, now if you know Jesus, he's not exactly a rule follower. Jesus agrees to heal the servant. We're like, what? What are you thinking? This is unheard of. There goes Jesus, breaking down social barriers again. And if that's not strange enough, like I said, centurions, they're kind of full of themselves. And they love to lord their power over us. But this guy, he says he's not worthy. He's a Roman centurion. He's not worthy to have Jesus, who's a Jew, who I've said, come to his house. What? I mean, people are scrambling to have Jesus at their house. People feel important when important people come to their house, right? But not this guy. This guy, he doesn't need the honor of Jesus' presence at his house. He just wants his servant healed. And I don't know, maybe because his motives were so pure, or maybe because his faith was so strong, Jesus just says the word and the servant is healed right at that moment. Can you believe it? He didn't even have to be there to heal him. Who is this Jesus?
Last week we began a series on stories of people who encountered Jesus. We looked at 4 fishermen, Simon, Andrew, James, John. They had several encounters with Jesus that culminated in answering his call, leaving everything to follow him. We looked at a financial profiteer, a tax collector named Levi. We don't know whether he had previous encounters with Jesus, but 3 of the 4 gospel writers tell us of the day Jesus came to Levi's tax booth and said, "Follow me." And like the 4 fishermen, Levi left everything and followed him. Now, while we know nothing of what preceded Levi's call, we know quite a bit of what resulted from it. Like the 4 fishermen, Levi became one of Jesus' 12, the inner circle of his disciples. Of course, we know him better by his other name, Matthew. Yes, the same Matthew who wrote the gospel who bears his name. Well, today we are encountering 2 more men who encountered Jesus. We find their stories in Matthew chapter 8. There are 5 reasons I want to look at both of them together this morning, besides the fact that one immediately follows the other in Matthew's account. And I want to walk through those 5 reasons this morning as we discuss the stories, as we encounter Jesus through their encounter of him. The first thing that these 2 have in common, and one of the reasons to look at them together, is because each one in these stories, each one who came to Jesus with a need, each of them was regarded as untouchable by the religious community. The first one because he was diseased. He was a leper. There are a lot of ideas, images that might come to mind when we think of leprosy. Many of them accurate, not all of them accurate, perhaps. Leprosy was very common back in Jesus' day. It still exists in parts of the world. It is treatable today by modern medicine. But leprosy was characterized by skin lesions as well as a number of other effects that are due to its impact on the nervous system, the nervous systems of the body. It does not affect the central nervous system. However, it can affect the sensory, peripheral, motor, and autonomic nerves in the following ways. It can create sensory nerve damage. When the sensory nerves are damaged, they cannot register pain. And this leaves extremities of hands and feet vulnerable to burns and injuries that can result in the loss of fingers, toes, hands, and feet simply because there's no pain sensing there to be able to protect. The normal things that would make us recoil from a hot coal would not register for a leper. And so you often see images of disfigurement based on those kinds of injuries and maybe amputations that resulted. There's often eye nerve damage. When the eye is affected, it, of course, can lead to blindness, particularly if the person does not know how to prevent injury due to dust or other irritants. There's motor nerve damage. When the motor nerves are involved, various forms of paralysis can occur, such as a dropped foot or dropped wrist, clawed hand, or other results. The autonomic nerve damage can cause hair loss and can affect the ability to sweat, leaving the skin dry and cracked and exposed to secondary infection. These types of symptoms were often very, very visible. The lesions, the sores would be all over a person's body, the dry, cracked skin often giving a somewhat grotesque appearance. It's not like you could really hide leprosy, and yet, to add insult to injury, the law was clear. This was a contagious disease. Leviticus 13 gave some very strict guidelines for recognizing leprosy. It actually kind of reads like a medical manual, guidelines. You go online to WebMD, and here's the list of symptoms. And I mean, it's very specific as you read through verses and verses of if this and this, and if this but not this, then it's leprosy, they're unclean. If it's this and this but not this, then they're okay, it's something else. And it was the priest who was equipped with that instruction from the law, and the priest who had the responsibility to evaluate and to declare clean or unclean. But what was also clear, and I'll read from Leviticus 13, anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkept, must cover the lower part of their face and cry out, unclean, unclean, whenever they would come in contact with anyone else. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. And thus, the leper who came to Jesus was considered untouchable. Now, the centurion, the Roman official, there was a different reason. He wasn't diseased, he was simply despised. And through being despised was also considered untouchable. Now, what's interesting is there is no Leviticus chapter 13 that spells this out as clearly. Yes, there are a number of laws in the Old Testament about things that would defile you and so forth. But there was also a clear sense in the Old Testament that God's heart was not to exclude the Gentiles, but through the Jewish people to bless the whole world, to bless all nations, but somehow that got lost in translation. By Jesus' day, the attitude was much like it's reflected in the book of Acts. Remember when Peter had his vision of the food that some was considered clean and some unclean, and Jesus in this vision said, get up and eat. And there was all this unclean food in this vision, and Peter says, no, I'm not going to eat anything. That's unclean. And Jesus says, what I have called clean, don't call unclean. 3 times he had that vision, and then after the 3rd time, God said to him, there's someone at your door, go see what they want. And he went down, and there were the servants of another Roman official asking him to come to their home. Because God had given this vision, Peter connected the dots, understood that God wanted him to go with these people, even though every Jewish instinct fought against it. Peter makes the journey and arrives at this official's home. He greets them. Verse 27 in Acts 10 says, while talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people. He said to them, and listen to this part, you are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. Now that's, again, kind of a loose interpretation of the law. That was a lot of tradition added on to the law. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. See, this is Peter. This is several years after the death and resurrection of Christ. The church has already begun, and this is Peter still struggling with this part of his formation, this part of his conscience being formed wrongly, but still he struggled with this sense of what was right and what was wrong in terms of associating with people. And of course, it's not just the fact that this Roman official was a non-Jew, not just the fact that he's a Gentile, but he's part of the conquering, invading army. He's part of the occupation. This Roman official, this centurion, was considered untouchable because he was very much despised. So these two, this leper and this Roman, have that in common. Second thing they have in common is, in spite of the fact that they were deemed untouchable, that each did end up receiving the healing that they requested. That's, of course, significant. But even more than that, the third point is that each did not simply receive the healing, but each was seen, respected, and affirmed by Jesus in a very personal way. When the leper came, Jesus could have said, "Oh, that's far enough. Don't come any closer." And he could have heard his request, and Jesus could have said the word and said, "Okay, I'll heal you, but I'm not going to get close to you." No, before the healing happened, Jesus reached out and touched this diseased body. And even after the healing happened, there's this really, really strange part of the story. And it doesn't just happen here, and I'm not going to suggest that I know exactly why it happened, but there is something I want to comment on that may be part of it, at least, in this case, and maybe in some of the others as well. Jesus says to him, "Now don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody what has just happened. But instead," he says, "go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." I think at least part of this, as Jesus knew all that this disease had robbed from this man, all the ways that he was ostracized. Jesus knew that for many of the religious leaders and in that community, for this man to go and say to everybody else, "This man Jesus healed me," was going to create some different kind of ostracism and another level on top of that. And so he says, "Don't tell anybody what happened, but go to the priest, do what Moses commands." And in that way, this man would have been fully restored to Jewish society. And beyond that, the priests, the leaders would probably have rejoiced and said, "Wow, look what God has done." While they were not able to see it through what Jesus did because of their animosity and their disdain for him. I don't know that that's part of it, but as I reflected on this story, I could imagine that maybe that was. Looking out for him, for his interests, trying to restore not only the body, wholeness to his body, but to restore so much of what that disease had taken from him. With the centurion, Jesus' respect, Jesus seeing him, affirming him, largely comes at the end of the story, although just the fact that Jesus engaged him and listened to him. And even before the conversation, the extended conversation, the man simply comes and says, "Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering." Technically, he doesn't actually ask for healing yet. He just comes with a heart that's breaking out of concern for his servant. And Jesus sees that and hears that and simply responds, "I'll go heal him," knowing what's on his heart. The centurion replies, "Lord, I don't deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed, because I understand what authority means. I also am I'm a man under, I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. I understand authority, and I know that you have authority that we can only imagine. If you just say the word, I know my servant will be healed. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished and said to those following him, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. He said to the man, go, and it will be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed that very hour. Two more things these stories have in common. Number 4, each demonstrated a deep faith. Maybe we could add the word a surprisingly deep faith. Have you ever looked at someone else? Maybe looked in a way that you thought wasn't appropriate to look, dressed in a way that you thought wasn't appropriate to dress, maybe acted in a way that you didn't think was appropriate to act, and you kind of made up your mind about them. Maybe they believed in ways that you were convinced were wrong. Maybe they were a Democrat or a Republican. And you pretty much made up your mind, well, that person can't be a Christian. That person certainly couldn't be right with God. That person certainly couldn't have more faith than I have. Sometimes it comes from surprising places. The shame's really on us for being surprised, isn't it? I didn't ask for a show of hands whether you've ever found yourself in that situation. But I'm going to put mine up because I have. Who would ever expect such deep faith from one who had lost so much? Or such deep faith from one who seemed to have it all, whose life looked easy? As part of the occupying army, not the occupied. As one who was an ungodly, we assume, unclean Gentile. Be careful judging others by external things. As God said to Samuel many hundreds of years earlier, man looks on the outward appearance, God looks on the heart. The last thing about these two stories is that each character in the story, each person who encountered Jesus had some insights about Jesus that continue to teach us today. It's not just faith, but some bold, some strong statements that reflected that deep faith. From the leper, Lord, if you are willing, you can heal me. I know you have the power to do this. And if you will it, it'll be done. From the centurion, just say the word. You not only have the power to do it, but you don't even have to be in the presence of the disease. You have authority that goes beyond space and time. You have authority that goes beyond the limits of the human mind. Just say the word and it will be done. We can learn from them. Surprised? Maybe we shouldn't be. Their encounters teach us two important truths about Jesus. There is no condition that makes us unwanted or untouchable by Jesus. There isn't. No condition. No disease. Nothing about our condition, our circumstance, that makes us unwanted or untouchable. Secondly, there is no category. And boy, we love our categories. Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, rich or poor. No categories. I'll say it again, Democrat or Republican. No categories that make us unwanted or untouchable by Jesus. This is gospel. This is good news. This is a message to share with the world. May God help us to let those truths touch us. And then as we say yes to follow him, to let him make us fishers of men, bearers of that message to the world around us who desperately needs to hear.